When the dust settled and the last gunshot echoed across the Afghan mountains, Marine sniper Sarah Chen had been forgotten. Left for dead in a remote outpost overrun by enemy forces, she became a ghost in the military records, another casualty of war whose body was never recovered. But Sarah Chen wasn't dead. For 18 months she survived in hostile territory using skills that transformed her from abandoned soldier to legendary hunter. When Navy SEALs stumbled upon traces of an American operative deep in Taliban territory, they expected to find bones. Instead, they discovered a woman who had become something far more dangerous than the enemy ever imagined. This is the true story of how abandonment forged a warrior, and how the forgotten soldier returned to save those who left her behind. The morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating base Raven. When Marine sniper Sarah Chen adjusted her scope for the final time, she had no idea that within 6 hours, her entire world would collapse into chaos and betrayal. The 26-year-old sharpshooter from California had spent 8 months at this remote Afghan outpost, perched like an eagle's nest on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Kunar province valleys. Her kill record was impeccable, 43 confirmed eliminations that had kept her fellow Marines alive and their supply routes clear. Sarah's spotter, Corporal Marcus Rodriguez, handed her a steaming cup of coffee as they settled into their elevated position. The morning briefing had been routine. Intel suggested Taliban movement in the southern valleys. Nothing their small team of 12 Marines couldn't handle. What intelligence hadn't mentioned was the coordinated assault being planned by over 200 fighters who had been studying their patterns for weeks. The attack came at 1400 hours with the sudden violence of a thunderclap. Sarah was tracking a suspicious figure through her scope when the first mortar round exploded in the compound below. The blast shook the mountainside, sending loose rocks tumbling down the cliff face. Through her earpiece she heard the panicked voices of her squad leader calling for immediate extraction. "Raven's Nest, this is Eagle Eye," Sarah transmitted using her call sign. "I count at least 50 hostiles approaching from the south ridge. Permission to engage." Static answered her. Then, sporadic gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The Taliban had surrounded the base with military precision, using the terrain Sarah knew by heart against her own people. She watched helplessly through her scope as her fellow Marines scrambled for defensive positions, their return fire inadequate against the overwhelming assault. Rodriguez grabbed her shoulder. "Sarah, we need to move. They're coming up the back trail." But Sarah was already calculating angles and distances. Her rifle spoke with deadly accuracy, each shot dropping an advancing fighter. 100 yards. 200. The Buckus, etc. Each bullet found its mark with the precision that had earned her the nickname Ghost Shot among her unit. For 30 minutes she held her position while Rodriguez fed her targets and ammunition. The radio crackled with desperate calls for air support, for extraction, for any kind of backup. But the nearest friendly forces were hours away, and the weather was turning bad. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains, bringing the kind of storm that grounded aircraft and turned dirt roads into impassable mud. "Ghost Shot. This is command," finally came through her earpiece. "Extraction helicopters are 40 minutes out. Hold your position." 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours. Sarah could see the compound below being overrun. Smoke billowed from the motor pool where their vehicles burned. The communications tower had been destroyed in the first wave of mortars. One by one, the defensive positions fell silent. Rodriguez tapped her arm urgently. "Movement behind us." They found the trail. Sarah turned to see a line of fighters climbing the steep path toward their sniper nest. Position that had been their advantage was now a trap. Below them lay a 300-foot drop. Behind them came certain death. To their left stretched a narrow ledge that might lead to another descent route. "Follow the ledge," Sarah ordered, shouldering her rifle. "I'll cover you." "Not without you," Rodriguez shot back. "That's an order, Corporal." Rodriguez hesitated, then began moving along the treacherous ledge. Sarah provided covering fire, her shots echoing off the canyon walls. But there were too many targets and not enough ammunition. When her rifle clicked empty, she drew her sidearm and continued fighting. The explosion came without warning. A rocket-propelled grenade struck the rock face 20 feet below their position. The shockwave sent both Marines sprawling. Rodriguez lost his footing and tumbled into a crevice between two boulders, his leg twisted at an impossible angle. "Marcus!" Sarah scrambled to reach him, bullets whining off the rocks around her. "My leg's broken," he gasped. "Can't move." The tactical situation was hopeless. Dozens of fighters were closing in from multiple directions. In the distance, Sarah could hear the distinctive whop-whop of helicopter rotors. But they were still too far away. She made a decision that would haunt her for months to come.
"I'm going to draw them away," she told Rodriguez, pressing her backup pistol into his hands. "When the helicopters arrive, signal them." Sarah, no. She was already moving, sprinting along the ledge with enemy fighters in pursuit.
Her plan was simple. Lead them away from Rodriguez, then find another way down the mountain. What she hadn't counted on was the second RPG that brought half the mountainside down in an avalanche of rock and dust. The world went dark. When Sarah regained consciousness, night had fallen and her body screamed with pain. She lay buried under a pile of rocks, her left arm pinned and useless. Blood matted her hair and her right leg felt wrong, probably fractured. But she was alive, hidden in a natural cave formed by the rock slide. Through a gap in the stones, she could see lights moving in the valley below. Helicopters had come and gone. She tried her radio, but only static answered. The device had been damaged in the avalanche. For all practical purposes, she was alone in hostile territory with no communication and no way to signal for help. Over the following hours, Sarah heard voices speaking Pashto as search parties combed the mountainside. They were looking for survivors, for bodies, for anything valuable in the wreckage of Forward Operating Base Raven. She remained motionless, breathing shallowly, as boots crunched past her hiding spot. On the third day, delirium from pain and dehydration nearly drove her to surrender, but years of training kicked in. She was a United States Marine, and Marines don't quit. Using her good arm, she began digging herself out of the rubble. The process took hours and left her exhausted, but by dawn she was free. No food, no water, no communication, and surrounded by enemies who would torture her for information before killing her. Her service pistol was missing, lost in the rock slide. All she had was a combat knife and the clothes on her back. Sarah made her way carefully down the backside of the mountain, avoiding the paths she knew Taliban patrols would use. Her survival training taught her to find water first, then shelter, then food. A mountain stream provided the water. An abandoned shepherd's hut gave her temporary shelter. Food would be harder. For the next week, she survived on edible roots and whatever small animals she could catch. Her broken arm began to heal crookedly, but it healed. Her leg was better, just badly bruised. More importantly, her mind remained sharp. She started planning. The Taliban had taken over the area completely. From her hidden observation posts, Sarah watched their patrols, learned their routines, and identified their leadership. They had established a forward command post in what used to be a village school, with supply routes running through the valley her base had once protected. That's when Sarah Chen, the Marine, began evolving into something else entirely. She started with small sabotage operations. A supply truck would develop mysterious engine trouble. Fuel caches would inexplicably catch fire. As sentries would disappear without a trace, their weapons vanishing with them. The local Taliban commander, a brutal man named Abdul Rashid, became obsessed with finding the ghost that was terrorizing his operations. He increased patrols, set traps, even brought in tracking dogs. But Sarah had advantages he couldn't understand. She knew this terrain better than anyone, and she had learned patience that only comes from being utterly alone. 2 months after the fall of Fob Raven, Sarah achieved something remarkable. She had acquired a Taliban sniper rifle from one of her targets and turned their own weapon against them. Her first shot with it eliminated a Taliban commander from 800 yards as he addressed his troops. The psychological effect was devastating. The ghost of Kunar, as they began calling her, had become a legend. But legends come with a price. Sarah's hair had grown long and matted. Her uniform was replaced by a mixture of local clothing and gear taken from fallen enemies. Her face, tanned by months of exposure, bore new scars and a hardness that hadn't been there before. Most telling were her eyes, still sharp as a sniper's, but now holding secrets and pain that aged her beyond her years. The winter was approaching, bringing challenges that would test even her evolved survival skills. Sarah established a series of hidden caches throughout the mountains, storing weapons, ammunition, and supplies taken from her enemies. She learned to move like smoke through the landscape, appearing only long enough to strike before vanishing again. One particularly successful operation involved infiltrating a Taliban supply convoy. Sarah had observed the route for weeks, noting that the trucks always stopped at a specific checkpoint where guards inspected cargo. She positioned herself on an overlooking ridge with her captured rifle and waited. When the convoy arrived, she didn't aim for the guards. Instead, she put a single bullet into the fuel tank of the lead truck. The explosion created chaos, and in the confusion, she picked off 4 fighters before melting back into the rocks. The surviving Taliban found nothing but empty shell casings and the growing legend of an American devil who couldn't be caught or killed. but the psychological toll was immense. Sarah began talking to herself, carrying on conversations with Rodriguez, with her family back home, with anyone who could fill the crushing silence of her isolation. She named her rifle Marcus and treated it like the companion it had become. Sleep brought nightmares of the base being overrun, of friends dying while she watched through her scope. The worst moments came when aircraft passed overhead. Sometimes they were American, heading to other missions in other valleys. Sarah would climb to high peaks and try to signal them with reflected sunlight from broken glass. But they never saw her, never slowed down, never brought the rescue she desperately wanted. 6 months after Fabraven fell, Sarah had become something unprecedented in modern warfare. A long-term deep cover operative who didn't know she was deep cover. The military had listed her as missing in action, presumed dead. Her family had received condolence letters. Her personal effects had been shipped home in a cardboard box. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Afghanistan, Sarah Chen was writing a different kind of legacy. The Taliban had learned to fear the valleys where she operated. Supply convoys required heavy escorts. Officers traveled only during daylight and never alone. The name Ghost of Kunar was whispered in the same breath as warnings about American technology and supernatural vengeance. Abdul Rashid, the Taliban commander who had taken over her former area of operations, developed an obsession with capturing this ghost. He offered rewards, brought in specialists, even consulted local shamans who claimed the American spirit was bound to the mountains by unfinished business. What Rashid didn't understand was that Sarah's unfinished business was simple: survival and revenge in equal measure. Every enemy fighter she eliminated was a small victory against the force that had destroyed her unit and left her for dead. Every successful sabotage operation was proof that Marines don't surrender, even when abandoned by their own. As winter's grip tightened on the mountains, Sarah faced her greatest challenge yet. Food became scarce, weather turned deadly, and the Taliban reduced their operations to essential movements only. But she had something her enemies lacked: absolute motivation and nothing left to lose. The woman who had entered these mountains as a military sniper was transforming into something far more dangerous: a predator who understood these hills better than those who had lived there all their lives. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through military legend, but Sarah didn't know that Navy SEALs operating in the region had begun hearing whispers of an American ghost haunting the mountains. She only knew that spring was coming, and with it would come new opportunities to strike back at those who thought they had won. Spring arrived in the Afghan mountains with the sudden violence of melting snow and rushing water. Sarah Chen emerged from her winter hideout like a creature born from the rocks themselves. 8 months of survival had transformed her beyond recognition. Her blonde hair, now darkened by dirt and sun, hung in braids woven with strips of cloth that helped break up her silhouette. Her face bore the lean hardness of someone who had learned to live on very little while demanding everything from her body. The Taliban had grown complacent during the winter months, assuming that their mysterious adversary had either died in the harsh conditions or finally fled the area. They were wrong on both counts. Sarah had used the forced inactivity of winter to plan an escalation that would bring the war directly to Abdul Rashid's doorstep. Her first target was the communications relay that Rashid's forces had established on a peak 12 kilometers from her old base. The position was heavily fortified and constantly guarded, but Sarah had identified a weakness. Every Tuesday, a supply detail climbed the mountain path, carrying fresh batteries for the radio equipment. The guards relaxed when they saw their own people approaching. Sarah intercepted the supply team at dawn, 2 kilometers below the relay station. 4 Taliban fighters found their path blocked by a woman who seemed to materialize from the morning mist. Before they could raise their weapons, she had eliminated 3 with her captured rifle and taken the 4th alive for interrogation. The survivor, a young fighter named Hamid, was barely 18 years old. Sarah had learned enough Pashto during her months in hiding to conduct a basic interrogation. What she learned chilled her to the bone. Rashid had been using her former base as a training ground for new recruits, teaching them to kill Americans using the fortifications her own Marines had built. "Tell me about the prisoners," she demanded in broken Pashto. Hamid's eyes widened. "What prisoners?" Sarah pressed her knife to his throat. "American prisoners. From the base attack." "There were no prisoners," he stammered. "Commander Rashid said all the Americans died fighting. He keeps their weapons as trophies." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent months hoping that some of her unit had been captured alive, that her sacrifice in leading enemies away from Rodriguez had meant something. Learning that they were all dead, that she was truly the sole survivor, nearly broke her resolve. But Marines adapt and overcome. Sarah tied up Hamid and continued to the communications relay disguised as a member of the supply team. The deception worked perfectly. She walked directly into the fortified position wearing a Taliban fighter's clothing, carrying their supplies, and speaking their language well enough to fool sentries who weren't expecting trouble. The explosion that destroyed the relay could be seen for 50 kilometers. Sarah had rigged the radio equipment to overload and ignite the ammunition stored nearby. The blast not only eliminated Rashid's ability to communicate with his scattered forces, but sent a message that the ghost of Kunar was far from finished. More importantly, the operation provided Sarah with intelligence that changed everything. Among the documents she captured from the relay station was a detailed map showing Taliban positions throughout the province. But what caught her attention was a notation in the corner. American call signs and coordinates for an operation scheduled to take place in 2 weeks. Navy SEALs were coming to the area. Sarah's hands trembled as she studied the map by candlelight in her mountain hideout. For the first time in 8 months, she felt a connection to her own people. The SEALs were planning a raid on a high-value target in a valley she knew well, but according to the Taliban intelligence, they were walking into a trap. The next 2 weeks became a frantic race against time. Sarah had to find a way to contact the incoming SEALs and warn them about the ambush, while simultaneously dealing with Rashid's increasing desperation to find her. The communications relay attack had enraged the Taliban commander. He tripled patrols, set up checkpoints on every mountain path, and brought in reinforcements from neighboring provinces. Sarah used this increased activity to her advantage. More targets meant more opportunities to strike. She began a campaign of psychological warfare that pushed Rashid's forces to the breaking point. Sentries would disappear in the middle of the night, found days later with their weapons missing, and warnings carved into nearby trees. Supply caches would explode just as patrols discovered them. Messages in Pashto would appear painted on rocks, taunting Rashid and questioning his ability to protect his own men. The American ghost grows stronger while you grow weaker. Read one message Sarah left at a checkpoint she had eliminated. Your men whisper prayers when they should be fighting. But the psychological campaign was taking its toll on Sarah as well. Months of isolation and constant danger had pushed her to the edge of what one person could endure. She talked constantly to Marcus, her rifle, carrying on detailed conversations about tactics and strategy. Sometimes she would argue with invisible figures from her past, relitigating decisions and battles that existed only in her memory. The breakthrough came when Sarah intercepted a Taliban courier carrying detailed plans for the ambush awaiting the SEALs. Rashid had positioned over 100 fighters in the exact valley where the American Special Operations Team planned to land. It was a perfect trap, one that would result in a massacre that would make international news. Sarah realized she faced an impossible choice. To warn the SEALs, she would have to expose herself and risk everything she had built over 8 months of survival. But if she did nothing, American warriors would die in a trap she could have prevented. The decision came naturally. Marines don't abandon Marines, even when they're Navy SEALs. Sarah began preparing for what she knew might be her final operation. She spent 3 days moving through the mountains to reach the valley where the SEALs would land. Along the way, she eliminated 2 Taliban observation posts and sabotaged the radio equipment that would have coordinated the ambush. But there were too many fighters for her to handle alone, and she was running out of time. The SEAL team was scheduled to arrive in 18 hours. That's when Sarah made a decision that defined her transformation from abandoned soldier to legendary warrior. Instead of trying to warn the SEALs from a distance, she would make contact directly. But first she would give them a demonstration of what 8 months in hell had taught her about warfare. Sarah spent the night moving through Taliban positions like a ghost made real. She had learned to move with absolute silence, to strike without warning, and to vanish before her enemies could react. By dawn, she had eliminated 12 fighters and captured enough weapons and ammunition to arm a small unit. More importantly, she had captured Abdul Rashid himself. The Taliban commander had been inspecting his ambush positions when Sarah found him. He was a heavy man in his 50s, with the soft look of someone who sent others to fight while he stayed safe. Sarah had watched him through her scope many times over the past months, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came when Rashid separated from his bodyguards to examine a position overlooking the SEAL landing zone. Sarah dropped from above like a hunting cat, her knife at his throat before he could cry out. "You have been hunting a ghost," she whispered in Pashto. "Now the ghost has found you." Rashid's eyes went wide when he realized he was facing the American devil his men had been hunting for months. The woman kneeling on his chest looked nothing like the clean-cut Marine sniper who had disappeared in the rock slide. This creature was lean and scarred, with eyes that held no mercy and hands that moved with deadly precision. "You're going to call off the ambush," Sarah told him.
And you're going to order your men to leave this valley. They will never obey, Rashid gasped. They will if they want their leader to live.
Sarah had planned to use Rashid as leverage to clear the ambush site, but the sound of approaching helicopters changed everything.
The SEALs were arriving early, and there wasn't time for negotiations. In the distance, she could hear the distinct sound of American rotors. 2 Black Hawks approaching the valley from the north. In less than 10 minutes, they would land in a killing zone that Sarah couldn't clear in time. That's when she made a decision that would become part of Navy SEAL legend. Sarah dragged Rashid to the edge of the cliff overlooking the landing zone and fired 3 shots into the air in rapid succession. The universal military signal for danger close. Then she began engaging Taliban positions with systematic precision, using her knowledge of their locations to devastating effect. From their helicopter, SEAL Team Commander Lieutenant Nathan Cross watched in amazement as muzzle flashes erupted from impossible positions throughout the valley. Someone was conducting a one-person assault on what appeared to be a major enemy stronghold. "Sir, we're seeing massive enemy activity at the landing zone," reported the pilot. "Someone's engaging multiple positions simultaneously." "Change of plans," Cross ordered. "Set us down on that ridge. We're going to find out who's doing our job for us." The SEALs fast-roped onto a rocky outcrop, 500 meters from where Sarah was conducting her assault. Through their scopes, they could see a lone figure moving between positions with inhuman speed and precision. Whoever it was had intimate knowledge of enemy locations and was eliminating them with the skill of a master sniper. "Ghost 6, this is Trident 1, Cross radioed on an emergency frequency, hoping the mysterious shooter had a working radio. "American forces to your north." "Identify yourself." Static answered him. Then, incredibly, a voice responded in clear English with a perfect American accent. "Trident 1, this is Ghost Shot. Marine sniper. 8 months missing in action. I have the area commander as prisoner and intel on enemy positions throughout the valley." The silence on the SEAL radio net stretched for several seconds. Missing in action for 8 months meant this person should be dead. But the tactical situation was undeniable. Someone with extensive knowledge of the area was systematically eliminating an ambush force that would have caught the SEALs completely by surprise. "Ghost Shot, this is Trident 1 actual." Cross responded personally. "What's your status?" "Operational but compromised," came the reply. "I can provide overwatch and intelligence, but I'm nearly out of ammunition and enemy reinforcements are moving toward our position." Cross made a command decision that would be debated in special operations circles for years to come. "This is a pre-season increment. Ghost Shot, we're moving to your position. Hold what you've got." What the SEALs found when they reached Sarah's position changed their understanding of what one person could accomplish when pushed beyond all limits. The woman crouched behind a boulder was clearly American, but she looked like she had been forged by the mountains themselves. Her equipment was a mixture of captured enemy weapons and improvised gear. Her face bore scars and a hardness that spoke of months of survival warfare. But her eyes still held the sharp intelligence and unwavering focus of a trained sniper. "Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, United States Marines," she reported crisply, despite her appearance. "FOB Raven overrun 8 months ago. I've been conducting harassment operations against enemy forces in this area." Lieutenant Cross stared at her in disbelief. "You've been operating alone for 8 months?" "Affirmative, sir. I have detailed intelligence on enemy positions, leadership, and supply routes throughout the province, and I have their area commander as prisoner." She gestured to where Abdul Rashid lay bound and gagged behind a nearby rock. The Taliban leader's eyes were wide with terror as he stared at the Americans who had appeared as if summoned by his nightmares. "Marines don't quit, sir. Junior," Sarah added quietly. "Even when everyone thinks they're dead." SEAL Team Medic immediately began assessing Sarah's condition while Cross tried to process what he was hearing. According to military records, Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen had been killed in action 8 months ago at FOB Raven. Her family had been notified, her personal effects had been returned, and yet here she was, very much alive, and having conducted what might be the longest solo operation in modern military history. But there was no time for detailed explanations. Sarah's assault on the Taliban positions had stirred up a hornet's nest of activity. Enemy reinforcements were converging on the valley from multiple directions, and the SEALs needed to extract before being overwhelmed. "Can you move?" Cross asked Sarah. "I've been moving for 8 months, sir. I'm not stopping now." The extraction that followed would become the stuff of legend. Sarah guided the SEAL team through mountain paths she knew better than anyone, avoiding enemy patrols and ambush sites with the instincts of someone who had learned to think like prey and hunt like a predator simultaneously. She carried Abdul Rashid's intelligence documents and led his bound form through terrain that would have challenged experienced mountaineers. By the time they reached the extraction point, Sarah Chen had accomplished something unprecedented.
She had survived 8 months alone in enemy territory, conducted successful operations against superior forces, prevented a major ambush against American Special Operations Forces, and captured a high-value target that intelligence agencies had been hunting for years. But as the rescue helicopter lifted off from the Afghan mountains, carrying Sarah away from the landscape that had been her home and her hell for 8 months, she realized her greatest challenge was yet to come.
She would have to find a way to return to a world that had already buried her once and somehow reconnect with the person she had been before the mountains taught her what it truly meant to be a Marine. The debriefing room at Bagram Airfield was sterile white walls and fluorescent lighting, a harsh contrast to the natural shadows and earth tones that had been Sarah Chen's world for 8 months. She sat across from a table full of officers whose rank insignia represented more authority than she had seen in nearly a year. Intelligence analysts, Marine Corps brass, Navy SEAL commanders, and CIA operatives all wanted to understand how one woman had survived what should have been impossible.
"Let's start from the beginning," said Colonel James Mitchell, the Marine Corps intelligence officer leading the debrief. "Tell us what happened at Fob Raven." Sarah's voice was steady, but those who knew how to look could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly tracked movement around the room. 8 months of hypervigilance don't disappear in a hospital bed. We were overrun by a coordinated assault. She began. Approximately 200 fighters with mortars, RPGs, and small arms. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. They had been watching our patterns, and you were in an overwatch position. Affirmative. Elevated sniper nest approximately 300 meters northeast of the main compound. When the attack began, I provided covering fire while extraction was called in. What Sarah didn't say was how she had watched her friends die through her rifle scope, how she had counted muzzle flashes and calculated impossible odds while her world collapsed below her. The clinical language of military debriefs couldn't capture the weight of being the only witness to her unit's final moments. According to our records, Colonel Mitchell continued, extraction helicopters found no survivors. The base was completely destroyed. The helicopters came, Sarah confirmed, but by then, enemy forces controlled the landing zones. I was trapped on the mountainside when an RPG brought down part of the cliff face.
The rock slide buried me for 3 days. A CIA analyst leaned forward.
And then you began conducting solo operations against Taliban forces in the area?
I began surviving, Sarah corrected. The operations were necessary for survival. But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that survival alone couldn't explain what she had become in those mountains.
Survival was finding water and shelter and staying hidden until rescue came. What she had done was something else entirely. A systematic campaign of warfare that had terrorized an entire region.
Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, the military psychologist assigned to Sarah's case, asked gently, "Can you tell us about your mental state during those 8 months?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment.
How could she explain the conversations with Marcus, her rifle? How could she describe the way she had learned to think like the wind, to move like shadow, to strike like lightning? How could she make them understand that she had become something the mountains had shaped, something that might not fit back into the world of barracks and formations and proper military protocols? "I maintained focus on the mission," she said finally. "Every day the mission was to survive, gather intelligence, and disrupt enemy operations when possible. You eliminated over 60 enemy fighters in 8 months, observed Lieutenant Nathan Cross, the SEAL commander who had found her. That's not survival, that's warfare at its most refined level." Sarah met his eyes. Cross understood, she realized. He had seen her in action, had watched her move through terrain like she was part of it. He knew that what had happened in those mountains was something that couldn't be fully explained in debriefs or case studies. "Marines adapt and overcome," she said simply. The questioning continued for hours. They wanted details about Taliban operations, leadership structures, supply routes, and defensive positions. Sarah provided everything with the precision of a trained intelligence officer. But she could see the real questions in their eyes. How had she survived? What had she become? And most importantly, could she be trusted to return to normal military service? After the formal debrief, Dr. Reyes asked to speak with Sarah privately. They walked to a quiet corner of the base medical facility where Sarah had been quartered during her evaluation. The psychiatrist was a small woman with kind eyes who had spent years helping soldiers deal with trauma, but she had never encountered a case like Sarah Chen. "How are you sleeping?"
Dr. Reyes asked.
When necessary, Sarah replied. Are you having nightmares?
Sarah considered the question.
She dreamed every night, but were they nightmares? In her dreams, she was back in the mountains, moving through familiar paths, hunting enemies who threatened American lives. In her dreams, she was competent and deadly and perfectly adapted to her environment. I dream about the mountains, she said. Do the dreams disturb you? No more than this place does. Dr. Reyes made a note. Can you elaborate? Sarah gestured at the clinical environment around them. In the mountains, I knew exactly what I was. I knew my purpose, my capabilities, my limitations. Here, I'm a problem to be solved, a story to be filed, a casualty who inconveniently survived.
You don't see yourself as a survivor? I see myself as a Marine who did her job under circumstances no one planned for. But even as she spoke, Sarah felt the weight of what those circumstances had cost her. The woman who had climbed into the sniper nest at Phoebe Raven 8 months ago was gone as surely as if she had died in the rock slide.
In her place was something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Something that might wear a uniform but would never quite fit back into the neat categories of military life. The bureaucracy moved slowly.
While Sarah underwent medical evaluation and psychological assessment, news of her survival leaked to the press. The story of the ghost of Kunar captured public imagination in a way that made military leadership uncomfortable. Sarah Chen became a symbol of American persistence, of individual heroism, of the warrior spirit that refuses to surrender. But Sarah herself struggled with the attention.
Reporters wanted to know about her incredible journey and inspiring survival story. They wanted details about her most dramatic kills, her closest calls, her emotional moments of despair and triumph. They wanted to turn 8 months of brutal warfare into a narrative that would sell newspapers and fill television programs. How does it feel to be a hero? Asked one persistent journalist who managed to corner Sarah during a medical appointment. It feels like doing my job, Sarah replied, walking away from the cameras. The truth was more complicated. Sarah had seen what heroism actually looked like. Marcus Rodriguez trying to protect his wounded leg while she drew enemy fire away from him. Her squad leader calling for extraction while bullets flew around him. Marines fighting hopeless defensive positions so their friends might have a few more seconds to escape. She had been a survivor, a predator, a force of nature. But had she been a hero? 3 weeks after her extraction, Sarah received unexpected visitors. The families of her fallen unit members had flown to Afghanistan to meet the woman who had witnessed their sons' and daughters' final moments. The meetings were heartbreaking and healing simultaneously. Rodriguez's mother, Maria, held Sarah's hands and asked about her son's last words. Sarah told her about Marcus's courage, his loyalty, his refusal to leave her behind. She didn't mention how she had heard him calling her name for hours after the rock slide, or how she had spent weeks hoping he might have survived despite the evidence. He saved my life, Sarah told each family, and it was true. Each fallen Marine had contributed something to her survival: Rodriguez's spotting skills, her squad leader's tactical knowledge, her unit's weeks of shared intelligence about enemy patterns. She had carried them all through the mountains, their training and friendship and sacrifice becoming part of what made her so deadly to their enemies. The most difficult meeting was with the family of her commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Torres. The captain's young daughter asked why Sarah had survived when her mother hadn't. Sometimes the mountain chooses who lives and who dies, Sarah said gently. Your mother died fighting to protect all of us. I lived to carry on the fight. After the families left, Sarah found herself facing a decision that would define the rest of her life. The Marine Corps wanted her to accept a medical discharge, take her benefits, and transition to civilian life. There would be book deals, speaking engagements, a chance to profit from her story. She could become Sarah Chen, the survivor, the inspiration, the living symbol of American military resilience. But there was another option. Lieutenant Cross had approached her privately with an offer that intrigued her more than any civilian opportunity. Naval Special Warfare was developing new programs for long-range reconnaissance and behind-enemy lines operations. They needed someone who understood what it meant to survive alone in hostile territory, someone who had proven they could adapt to any environment and accomplish their mission regardless of support or resources. You've already done things that we trained for years to attempt, Cross had told her. The question is whether you want to do them officially. Sarah thought about the offer while walking the perimeter of Bagram Airfield. The base was secure, well supplied, and connected to a vast network of American military power. It was everything Fabreven had been meant to be before the mountains and the enemy in bad luck turned it into a killing ground. But as she walked, Sarah realized that 8 months in the Afghan mountains had changed something fundamental about her relationship with safety and certainty.
The mountains had taught her that she was capable of more than anyone had imagined, including herself. They had shown her what it meant to be completely self-reliant, to trust her own judgment above all else, to find strength in solitude rather than fear in isolation.
2 days later, Sarah met with Colonel Mitchell to give her decision. "I want to stay in the Corps," she said.
But not in a regular unit. You're thinking about the special operations option?
I'm thinking about doing what I do best. Finding enemies in places they think they're safe, and making them pay for underestimating American resolve.
Colonel Mitchell studied her carefully. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "You've been through trauma that would break most people." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since her extraction it was a predator's smile rather than a survivor's. "Sir, with all due respect, the trauma was what the enemy experienced. I just learned who I really am, when everything else is stripped away."
The paperwork for her transfer to Naval Special Warfare took months to process, but eventually Sarah Chen found herself at a training facility in Virginia where operators learned to disappear into hostile environments and emerge weeks or months later with intelligence-eliminated targets or rescued personnel.
Her instructors were initially skeptical.
Sarah might have survived 8 months alone, but could she work with a team? Could she follow orders after months of making every decision herself? Could she scale back her lethality to fit within the rules of engagement that governed official operations? The answer came during a training exercise that was meant to test her ability to work with other operators. Sarah was paired with a team of Navy SEALs for a mock infiltration and reconnaissance mission in the Virginia mountains. The scenario involved gathering intelligence on a simulated enemy camp without being detected. Sarah studied the terrain for exactly 17 minutes before presenting her team leader with a complete tactical plan that accounted for weather patterns, enemy patrol schedules, and 3 different extraction routes. When the exercise began, she moved through the forest like she was part of it, leading the SEALs to observation positions they hadn't known existed and gathering intelligence with a precision that left her instructors speechless. "How did you know about that hidden path?" one of the SEALs asked, after they completed the mission in half the allotted time. "Mountains speak to you if you know how to listen," Sarah replied. But the real test came when the instructors threw them a curveball. Halfway through the exercise, they announced that one of the SEAL team members had been wounded and needed immediate extraction while the mission continued. It was the kind of impossible choice that Sarah had faced in the mountains of Afghanistan. Abandon the mission to save a teammate or complete the objective while someone suffered. Sarah looked at her wounded teammate, then at the simulated enemy positions they still needed to scout. Without hesitation, she handed her rifle to another team member and picked up the injured SEAL in a fireman's carry. "Mission first," she said, "but Marines don't leave Marines behind. But we'll complete the objective, but we do it together." Over the next 6 hours, Sarah carried her teammate while simultaneously guiding the team through a complex reconnaissance mission that required them to gather intelligence from multiple positions across difficult terrain. She never slowed down, never showed strain, and never compromised the quality of their intelligence gathering. When the exercise ended, the lead instructor approached Sarah with something approaching awe. "Staff Sergeant Chen, in 20 years of running these courses, I have never seen anyone carry a wounded teammate through a complete mission while maintaining operational effectiveness. Sir, 8 months ago I learned that the only unacceptable outcome is failure. Everything else is just a tactical problem to be solved." 6 months later, Sarah Chen received orders that would have been impossible to imagine when she first climbed into that sniper nest at FOB Raven. She was being deployed as part of a joint special operations unit tasked with deep reconnaissance and direct action missions throughout the Middle East. Her official designation was Maritime Unit Deep Reconnaissance Specialist, but her teammates called her by the nickname that had followed her from Afghanistan, Ghost. The night before her deployment, Sarah stood on the deck of the aircraft carrier that would take her to her new area of operations. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, as vast and dangerous as the Afghan mountains had been. But this time she wasn't alone. This time she was part of a team of operators who understood what it meant to disappear into hostile territory and emerge victorious against impossible odds. More importantly, she was no longer Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, who had been abandoned in the wreckage of FOB Raven. She was Ghost, forged in the mountains of Afghanistan and tempered by 8 months of survival warfare. She was a Marine who had learned that the only limits on human capability are the ones we accept, and she had accepted none. In her gear bag was a rifle she had named Marcus, in honor of the spotter who had taught her that Marines never abandon their own.
In her mind were the voices of every fallen comrade from FOB Raven, reminding her that some fights are worth continuing no matter the cost, and in her heart was the absolute certainty that she had found her true purpose, to be the ghost that haunts America's enemies, the sniper who strikes from impossible positions, the Marine who refuses to accept defeat even when the entire world believes she's dead.
The mountains had abandoned Sarah Chen to die in the wreckage of her former life. But from that wreckage had emerged something far more dangerous than the woman who had entered those peaks 8 months earlier.
The enemy had tried to bury her, not realizing they were planting a seed that would grow into their worst nightmare. Now, as her ship moved toward new battles in distant waters, Sarah smiled the same predator's smile she had worn in the Afghan mountains. Somewhere out there, in places where America's enemies thought they were safe, targets were waiting for ghosts to find them. They would learn what the Taliban had learned. In the mountains of Kunar province, when you think you have killed a Marine, you should make very sure the job is finished, because if it isn't, you haven't eliminated a threat. You've created a legend.